So maybe we'll open it up to questions or observations.
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit about special educational status and how a child is that ready?
Sure, be happy to. So the question was, what is special immigrant juvenile status and how does a kid get it? This is one of the most poorly understood legal remedies for undocumented children, and it is poorly understood by the community at large, but particularly with immigration attorneys that have an obligation, I think, to understand this. Special immigrant juvenile visa is a recognition that children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents are in a unique situation and thus need their own pathway to getting a green card. So basically, the thing that gets complicated about special immigrant juvenile status is that children need to get a court order, a state court order, that says basically those things, that this child has been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And then once they have their state court order, they can go on and apply for their green card with immigration. The problem with this is that state courts are generally have nothing to do with immigration. And so when you ask a state court judge to get involved in an immigration case and issue these findings so that we can apply for the green card, there's a lot of questions that are asked, and there's a lot of resistance because they don't want to be seen as getting involved in the immigration. There's also, I can tell you, for the Portland area, one of the issues that we have is that we have a lot of kids that are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, and they're in ORR detention, and they're about to turn 18. And once you turn 18, ORR no longer holds on to kids. So these kids, specifically, that don't have anyone necessarily to reunify with because they're abused, abandoned, or neglected, the kid's birthday present on his 18th birthday is to get ICE called. And ICE used to come and pick the kid up and take him to Tacoma, the adult detention facility in Seattle. So one of the things that we would try to do would be to get that kid into DHS custody, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health Services in Oregon, so that the kid wouldn't be taken up to Tacoma. And those hearings, I can't tell you how contested they were. We had DAs that would oppose the motions. We would have DHS itself who said, we don't have resources to place these kids. We don't have an appropriate location with someone who has the training, the family training needed. And I guess the point of all of that is just to highlight, again, the sort of idea that there's going to be this kid doing this on him by himself, applying for special immigrant juvenile status, getting this court order in order to apply for the green card. I can tell you now, though, that there's, one of the issues that we see in Portland for kids that we even get legal status for is that on their 18th birthday, if they have legal status, or even before that when we get them legal status, if there is no follow-up placement, the kids get released onto the streets in Portland. And if they're lucky, we can get them into a homeless shelter, which can be really complicated, especially if they're under 18, because they have to have their own bedroom, and there isn't the services that are available. So the system is just sort of barely hanging on. And again, I think that everyone there wants it to be different. So it's not that there's mean people that love punishing children. But the system that's been developed needs a lot of work. And part of the reason it's not getting the work is because people don't know that it's happening, which is, again, why it's exciting that you are all listening on the edges of your seat about this huge social problem.
And I think one of the challenges, too, with SIJ is that there are a number of facilities that won't serve as the sponsor. So in Illinois, for example, in Chicago, the facilities that detain 600 children, even though quite a few are eligible for SIJ, they won't sign the court order in state court. So the state court is not interested in proceeding with these dependency findings. And at the same time, there are these arguments, well, they're in ORR custody, they're safe, they're cared for. Why would we take them into state custody when we have no funding, few resources? There's a funding disincentive to take these children into custody because, at least in Illinois, there's this movement to lessen the number of kids in foster care. And so children that are abused, abandoned, neglected in a country that don't know anybody, these are going to raise their length of stay metrics in the state foster care system. And so they lose funding, or they get less funding as this metric goes up. So there's really not a financial incentive for them either to take these kids into custody. So while you have kids that are detained for 6 months and a year that could then get legal status, the facilities are in a position where they're not willing to sign it. So it depends on the facilities, but there are kind of windows. In New York, I think they sign, and so there are kids that are getting SIJ.
And that's just, the point is just that it's complicated, and
It's local.
and it's also, there's a real lack of education about what it is, because in Oregon even, you can get these findings without having to be taken into Oregon DHS custody. So it's not that our Oregon social work has to become involved. They can be if that's the best sort of alternative, but it's not necessary. And to expect that children are navigating this system on their own is really the part that is the hardest, because education can happen, and with the right resources, the judges are interested and they're willing to understand what their role is and how they can play it. But without someone explaining what's going on, there's really, state court and federal immigration law don't have a lot of overlap. And so there's a lot of questions and a lot of issues about it, which is really unfortunate, because that's the whole purpose that this remedy was available. And it's only available for a very brief window when the child is young. And so if you don't have someone involved in advocating for the kid, that window is going to close.
So it sounds like from what you guys are saying, detention centers these kids are put into are like jails for the most part. I was kind of wondering what the services are providing while they're in these detention centers. And it seems to me like, especially for like an older child, one that's turning 18, 16, 17 years old, if they were given education services and things like that, they could be a better advocate for themselves. And also, along with that, like for the younger kids, losing time in education and things like that at such an early age is a terrible detriment for later on. I was just wondering what the extent of the services provided while they're in this detention center. Like, is it just like jail? Like, you guys are stuck here for 24 hours a day, you get 1 hour out of your cell.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what
No, that's a great question. So the 1997 Flores Settlement Agreement dictated the types of services that should be available to children when they're detained. And so that,
when ICE got sued
Right.
because of what they were doing to the kids, the court got involved and said, no, here are the list of basic standards that you have to meet. So that's what the Flores settlement was the court outlining what basic requirements ORR had to provide for children.
so education, recreation, religious observation, 3 meals a day, snacks. But I think what's important, so these nonprofits run these facilities, and I think that they try their level best to make them comfortable, safe, home-like environments. But I think it's very difficult when you have 250 children in a building to do that, no matter what color you paint the walls. And so I think the kids' experience, the way that they talk about these facilities, is as if it were a jail. And so some facilities, yes, are rented bed space in juvenile halls, and others are nonprofits. So
Or homes,
Yeah, or
where
homes.
it's a kid with a family. But you're really right. There aren't a lot of resources, and they've got one classroom where all the kids come in, and you've got kids that are monolingual Spanish speaker, maybe a monolingual indigenous language. You've got kids who maybe were about to graduate high school in their home country, and kids who've never been in a classroom in their day.
Or kids that are dreamers, kids that came
Right.
as 2-year-olds but were apprehended for
and don't
some
speak
internal-
any other language but English, and so it is really complicated. And for all of the things that are frustrating and difficult, ORR is working really hard to provide the kids the best possible environment with the limited circumstances. But again, I think it all comes down to, for the most part, it just looks like a figure. It's a budget issue. And ORR isn't getting the funding it needs because there really isn't people who know about this problem and are willing to speak up and say, no, this is where funding needs to go. You can't treat children like this. And I think that people in the ORR system generally are people who are compelled to the work because they want to make the lives of the children better. But, you know, like Lauren said, painting the walls only goes so far. And a kid knows when a kid's locked up. And there are a lot of things that OR is doing that are good and a lot better than where we've been, but there's a lot of progress to be made.
And I think we need to think outside of the box. I think, no matter what we do in the facilities, we're still detaining children. So let's look to other countries that don't detain children,
Right.
and what they're doing to provide youth the services they need, to pursue legal status, to,
We're detaining children without access to attorney to represent them, without an ability to challenge their detention. It's shocking that it exists in the system, from my perspective.
And I think in part that's because there's very little distinction made between children and adults in immigration law. There are very few remedies that are specific to children. And so I think the model that we have used for adults historically is what we're grafting onto children with some minor modifications. So.
Except that adults in a lot of these
Right.
contexts have more rights than do children. Adults can dispute their detention in adult immigration facilities in a way that children can't. When I first started in Portland and we were working with the kids in Norcor, they would bring the kids to immigration court completely shackled, their arms to their waists and their legs shackled. They don't do this anywhere else really in immigration court. They don't do this with adults. They don't do it in juvenile court. If you've ever been to observe a juvenile court, they don't bring in the children shackled. And it was right, but it's more on a case-by-case determination than
Montgomery County, that's true. It's not true all over the state.
really. So that was a big hurdle that we worked for, that you're not detaining adults, you're detaining adults, but you're not locking up adults for their immigration hearing. Why are you locking up children? And without attorneys looking at this problem, the problems aren't going to be addressed. Kids don't know that they can say, why do I have to be handcuffed for this hearing? And again, it's the importance of all of us sort of paying attention to what's going on to these children. Keep going.
You mentioned that there was an average detention time frame of about 50 some odd days. Is that the time it takes ICE to find a parent to take the child? And if they don't have a parent to come pick them up, then they go through this process you're talking about?
So ICE apprehends the children and then transfers them to ORR. So it's ORR's responsibilities, nonprofit organizations, to do family reunification. So a parent or a family member or a family friend will come forward and fill out this huge packet of documents. Now, if the parent is undocumented, they can still petition for their child. But imagine living here for 10 years, you've got 3 kids, you have to come forward, tell them where you live, fingerprint, provide proof of income, even if it's under a false name. I mean, there's a number of hurdles to petition for your children. So what I found was that there are a lot of parents that don't come forward. And so children get removed, they get deported, and then try again. And so the experience of a child to know, well, I'm in this country, mom can get me out of here, why is she not getting me out of here? Creates some, really difficult conversations and kind of divides in relationships of families. So it's up to the family reunification specialists in these facilities to try to get to find sponsors, to get all the documents in, to make an assessment if this is a safe place, and then the child can be released. Now, there's a whole number of complicating factors, which may be if a parent has a deport order, if a parent has some sort of criminal history, if the relationship is difficult to substantiate. So you see this in a lot of cases of Indian children where there just aren't documents to demonstrate that this person is related to this person is related to this person. They need photographic evidence to show that there's a relationship. So there's a number of ways in which I think they try to set up some safeguards, but there are also a number of obstacles in terms of, I've seen parents denied reunification with their child because the parent was undocumented, had 4 kids, and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and they said, well, that's not enough income to support the number of kids, and so you either need to move to a new apartment and get a second job, or your kid is going to get deported. So some of it is arbitrary, I think. Some of it, I think, is that ORR is an administrative body and they're making decisions about family reunification, which in my opinion should really be in front of a judge or in a court. And so ORR, I think, has a lot of discretion about which kids get released and which don't.
But just to be clear, it's not ORR that's deporting the kids.
Right.
The idea is a judge is only going to tolerate the kid appearing in court a certain number of times before the judge orders the kid deported. Because the judge is only going to grant X number of continuances until it's like, well, present your case or I'm going to deport you. And a child that's unrepresented at that stage doesn't really have a lot of case to present.
So it's two different processes, two different forks. One is kind of the family reunification custody piece, which doesn't impact the legal. The legal continues. Even if a child's released, they still have their immigration court. They still have to go to court, find a lawyer, and make their case, even though if they're living with mom and dad. And so they're engaged in two processes, which I think is really difficult for a lot of them to understand, that when I'm released from detention, I still have to go to court, or I'm going to court, but the judge can't send me back to live with my mom. So, yeah.
More questions? Yeah.
Just to go back to the youth that are detained in detention facilities or secure facilities, are they integrated with criminal youth?
No.
Maybe not in this state, but possibly in other states?
They shouldn't be. No, it is a very it's a very separate process. You know, that being said, they have pods and wings, but it's not. So they're not they shouldn't be really interacting with each other.
The idea that, low risk must
Well, yeah, and that happens because of their, so, ORR evaluates the risk of a child and places them depending on the evaluation of risk. And so risk factors include prior adjudications. So you have a kid that's been accused of some terrible murder, rape, the whole thing, served his time and is now in ORR custody awaiting to get deported. And you have a kid who's a flight risk, because he made a comment about, God, I'd love to get out of here, and they deem that kid to be a flight risk. They're going to put those two kids in a secure facility together. So some of the determinations about who's a high risk and low risk and what is high risk and low risk does result in kids mixing in a way that could maybe be seen as inappropriate at times. But it's hard because there's only certain levels of facilities that can be provided, and right. But sometimes it does. I get surprised at who sometimes gets placed together. Because one of the things they're really worried about is kids running. And so...
And they run.
They do run. And they're incredibly good at it.
Yeah, they're really savvy. In Chicago, if you go one way, you go to the lake, and the other way, you go to Clark Street, which is a super busy street in the Latino neighborhood, and they know, they pay attention when they, if they go out on an outing or if they're, wherever they're going. So, so I think there were maybe, during the 3 years of my research, maybe 15 kids escaped. And the nonprofit staff, they have to run after the kid and tackle them and bring them back, or call the police. I mean, they're really put in very difficult situations. And, this child they're caring for, they then have to be the police officer.
Go back to sponsorship. You don't, you've done a lot of requirements or you don't have to be a parent, correct?
Correct.
It could be anybody with a child. You need to repeat the question.
Sorry, so the question was, do you have to be a parent to sponsor the child out? And no. So it can be a family member, it can be a family friend, but you have to demonstrate that there is some relationship. So very rarely will ORR release to a person the child knows nothing about. And I think the facility staff try to develop relationships over the phone. So having the child call the sponsor, having them exchange letters, trying to give the child some option.
That being said, it's also a great market for people who are willing to be sponsors and demonstrate some kind of connection. And people are definitely making money off of children and families in this situation.
In Chicago, there's a large Indian community of children that are detained, and you see the same sponsors come up for multiple of the children with the very similar story. And we met at a wedding, and this is a family friend, but
It's a
and-
big
yeah.
concern in trafficking and human
Absolutely.
trafficking cases, because you'll have human traffickers that have an entire network surrounding, these children are priceless to them. They're going to make them a lot of money, and so they will provide attorneys for the children, and they will provide sponsors, and they will provide people at every step of the way with the hope of getting the child out of detention and back into the trafficking environment that the kid was planned for.
So some of it is trafficking, and then some of it, for example, kids from the Fujian province, they have $80,000 debt that they have to pay back, and they're not making any money by being detained. And so the traffickers or the snakeheads or the travel agencies that are facilitating their migration have a financial investment in this child paying back the debt. So they're going to do everything. So you see, OR tracking, the snakehead attorneys or, folks that seem to be rearing their heads in multiple locations.
So it can be as complicated as that and sort of as basic as just families reaching out to other people to try to pay them to be sponsors.
Absolutely.
How do they find, so you say there's family reunification specialists, it seems like it would be really frequent if they just would be able to find it.
Right. So, OR has a hotline parents can call if they have the savvy to figure out the number.
Or what
and-
ORR is, or why a
Yeah,
kid would be.
it's a labyrinth. So when the child comes into the facility, the reunification specialist sits down with them and says, write out a list of everybody you know and their phone numbers. And the kids may not know. They may know, they may not. And the children may have been counseled to not give up that information either. But then they'll just work their way through the list. So yeah, it's tricky. So ultimately the child is deported if they're not eligible for relief and don't have a sponsor.
But the primary way that parents are finding out that their children are, one, detained, and two, where they are, is by the child reaching out and making a phone call. And I've definitely worked with children and families where it's been a week or 2 weeks until the child has been given that phone call and been able to reach out to the parent. And so there's that period of time when the parent has no idea what's happened to their child, which is especially at issue when the parents know that the child is coming into the United States, and so they hear word that they've left Mexico, and then that's it. And a lot of times, parents think that their child has been killed. It's really heartbreaking, and the need for parents to be in the loop is really big, but it's complicated because you don't know, again, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Yeah.
How are you working in this, manage all of the stress that, as a professional, you couldn't help but have when dealing with these kids? So in your professional life, how do you do this day in and day out and not want to shoot yourself in the head?
No, that's a really
a great
great
question.
question. Repeat the question. Why do I not want to shoot myself in the head?
It's so heartbreaking, I just wouldn't know how I could draw the line and stay sane and still be
Well,
alive.
absolutely. And, I wanted to do immigration, but I had no interest necessarily in children or I didn't do anything in law school that set me up for working with kids, especially a lot, initially when I was working, it was just the secure and staff secure facility. So these were what ORR had determined sort of the hardest with the kids. And it was a huge learning curve to me, but it sort of goes back to why I love immigration and what really makes it work for me is the incredible inspiration that these kids are. And as heartbreaking and terrible as it is day to day, the kids that I work with are so resilient and such fighters. For some reason, that just works for me to sort of give me what I need to keep going. It is hard. I've definitely had my share of breakdowns over it. And that's a learning process too, about where your boundaries are, and you make mistakes and you let someone step over a boundary and you realize that next time that boundary is, even more firm. And you have, I'm also not doing it now. 5 years was enough, if that gives any indication. But I really think that the system could be genuinely improved if people just knew what was going on. And so I think it's out there to be better, and I think that the more resources that can be given to kids and the more resources that can be given to the attorneys, that it is a workable solution, because the law is out there to protect these kids, you know? And it's just getting those kids to that protection. So it's never that their cases were so complicated and unwinnable. It was just that I was the only one doing it. And so if I filed that stay, it meant not going on vacation. And was it worth it to me? And once or twice, that's an easy decision. But when it starts to take over your life, it becomes a lot more complicated. So I do think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I think it's partly you guys paying attention and just knowing that's going on. And every time we make that step, and every person that you talk to about this, the more attention that's brought to this, the better it's going to be for everyone, including the attorneys.
Yeah, and I mean, I would echo that. I mean, I think if I were only in the detention facilities, I wouldn't be able to continue. But I think looking at and building relationships with people over the long term. So there was one youth I worked with very early on who now is 24. He's getting his associate's degree. He just had his first child. Went to his wedding. I mean, these like just very kind of beautiful. I understand what he struggled. I understand the abuse he suffered. But people do get better. People are resilient. And I think, you know, those few people that, you know, you continue these relationships on for the long term, not just when they win their asylum or they get their SIJ, but over the course of their lifetimes, I think makes it worthwhile.
I had a kid recently that I worked with for a long time call me up, and he just got his first job. He wanted to take me out. I can't remember what it was. I think it was breakfast. He wanted to take me out to breakfast to thank me for everything that I had done. And I said, okay, well, you know, what time do you want to meet? And he was like, well, I get up really early for work. And I was like, okay, well, you know, what time do you, so 8? He was like, 10:30, 11? You know, and you're just sort of reminded of, not only did he have this huge, huge heart wanting to take me out to breakfast, but he was also a teenager who thought 10:30 was really early in the morning. Yeah.
Well, I have 2 questions. The first is, for children who are placed in Oregon and in northern states, are they detained locally or are they detained at the border? And if they're detained locally without documentation, how are they differentiated between homeless children who are abandoned by local parents?
So that's a really great question, and one of the things, I will repeat the question. So the question is sort of twofold. One being sort of where are children detained in general? How is it determined what state that they're placed in? And then how do you differentiate between a child who is who doesn't have any paperwork and may have legal status, may just be a homeless child? So the first question about where a child is placed is one of the things that I think is also a huge problem with the ORR system. So basically, a child is brought into ORR custody, they make the determination of what sort of level of risk this child is, and then they look for an open bed. So you've got kids in Texas that come up to Oregon, go to New York, they go all over the United States, and one of the problems is, let's say you're working with a kid that's in a staff secure facility. So it's not the highest level, but it's the next step down. You've got this great case going, right? And you're doing SIJ, so you're in state court here in Oregon, and you've got your hearing next week, and the facility calls you and says, bad news. Yesterday when we were going to the dentist, he said he wanted to get out of here. So we're going to have to step him up to secure, and it turns out there's no space available at the secure facility here in Portland. So we put him on a plane last night to Virginia, and he's in the facility in Virginia. That's it. Your kid's gone. Can't come back for court. The judge isn't interested when your client's not there. He's going to hang out in Virginia until maybe they decide he's no longer a flight risk, his behavior gets better, and then they'll send him back to your staff secure facility. Then you get to do the whole thing again, pleading with this child. Don't blink at anyone the wrong way, or there goes your case. And it's a huge frustration, and it's really hard. One of the things that I tried to do was inspire pro bono attorneys. You know, but for them, the idea that they would file their appearance in immigration court here in Portland, and then if their kid got transferred, would have to sort of be at the mercy of the immigration judge to grant their motion to withdraw, or that attorney is going to be on the hook for the case when it gets transferred to Virginia. So it's a really big burden for these kids getting access to to counsel, to even pro bono attorneys who aren't really willing to take that risk of having to follow a kid throughout the United States, which is understandable. So, and in regard to your second question, it's definitely, so the kids are apprehended and placed into ORR custody by ICE or Customs and Border Patrol in two primary ways. One is entry into the United States. So generally, homeless kids aren't hanging out in the desert in Arizona. So that's sort of how that population works. But in the past, too, a lot of the kids in ORR custody were kids who were having juvenile delinquency issues. And so ICE was automatically being called, and ICE was then detaining the kids. So you had a lot of kids who maybe got convicted or got charged with something, and then the Obama administration was really going after, anyone that had any criminal issue, and so you would have kids that would have a probation violation and be in court, and ICE would come and pick them up. And so occasionally in those situations, we had kids that were unable to prove that they were in fact U.S. citizens, but everything looked like it was. In those cases, it's supposed to be the burden of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that are the attorneys in the immigration court, to prove that the child is not a U.S. citizen. So the burden is on them. But we've definitely had those kids. It's an exciting day when I find a citizen, because that's a fun way to win, sort of, because you're not supposed to deport U.S. citizens, as it turns out. But it's hard. A lot of the clients are living on the fringe, and documentation is not the strong suit.